Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Recently, the Distributist made an interesting video where he talked about the sexual abuse scandals in Hollywood. And there was a part towards the end I found especially interesting, which was about the moral system that Hollywood somewhat has, or espouses at least, and why they might espouse that and its relationship to the sorts of movies that they make. And so I invited him to come have a conversation about this, to flesh it out more and talk about it and really delve into it. So I hope you enjoy. So in your video, you ended on a subject I found very interesting, which is that in the wake of the sexual scandals that are coming out of Hollywood, that trying to recover from this, Hollywood may well turn to the feminist side for giving them more control. But it brings up an interesting subject, which you touched on, and I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on, which is that much of the reason for the feminist involvement at all in an industry that doesn't, in what it produces, have much to do with feminism at all, is that the feminism gives cover for the things that people who don't want to be good want cover for, so they can appear to be virtuous. So I'd like to hear more what you think about that relationship that it has in terms of an industry that puts out lots of immoral products, that the people who do this may want to virtue signal in a defensive way so that people don't make the obvious inference.
Well, I mean, of course, the word I wanted to use was indulgences. I kind of forgot to use that in the video. Essentially, feminism is used by a lot of men, and you can see this in the revelations of sexual harassment. They use feminism in association with things like the gay community as an attempt to try to get them out of culpability for these harassment issues. In Harvey Weinstein's confessions, he tried to imply that he was going to make an anti-NRA film, and sort of like he flashed his progressive bona fides just to try to soften the revelation that he'd been essentially harassing women over his 30-year career. And you see the same thing in Kevin Spacey and all this stuff. And to a large degree, I think that that's the system that feminists use. Very few of these directors are really dyed-in-the-wool believers, but they understand that feminism is something that they can pay their respects to, and essentially get a blind eye turned to their activities. They're more than willing to play ball. And I think that this latest crisis in Hollywood, we could see the end. We could see the end to this this system, and feminism and progressivism as a religious orthodoxy could assert itself in a more real way. And that's going to be interesting to see what happens, I guess, right?
Yeah. Now, where do you see the tension between, as it asserts itself, somebody who doesn't need cover?
Well, I mean, someone
who gets anything out of the strictures of it, though. Somebody who isn't harassing anybody doesn't need to show that they're very, very virtuous. So a person of any sort of reasonable virtue wouldn't really get anything out of this exchange, would they?
Well, yeah, but I'm not so sure, though, right? Because I mean, they'll nail you for almost anything, politically. It can be a faux pas in terms of, I mean, someone like, I'm thinking like someone like Clint Eastwood, right? People have been trying to nail him for his political views, making him, I mean, he didn't have as big as a fall as Mel Gibson did, certainly. But, with the whole chair thing that he did in the 2012 Republican National Convention, where he supported Mitt Romney, and since then, as being an outspoken conservative, there have been lots of people who've sort of tried to make him persona non grata. So it's not like you can completely evade the feminists by just being a conservative, right? The problem is that the boundary of acceptability is constantly moving, and so it's not something that can be just, you can't just land on and go like, okay, I'm clean, you can't touch me, because the whole point of this system is to confuse people about when they've crossed the line.
Although it strikes me there's a difference, though, because things like what Weinstein et al. Were doing are the sort of thing that would shock everybody, and except a lot of people in Hollywood, and would lose you the support of everybody again, except for many of the people in Hollywood. Um, but if a person isn't doing anything nearly that bad, it is certainly true that you can become a pariah on the left for anything or nothing. You know, probably the best example I can think of was that woman. I can't remember her name now, but where she actually tweeted out something that was supposed to be a leftist piety about
Mhm.
AIDS in
Yeah.
Africa.
Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS. Oh, haha, I'm white. I forgot.
Which was
Yeah,
supposed to be
it's
a
supposed to
leftist
be.
piety.
It's supposed to be like, oh, look at me, I have white privilege. But
Yes. Yeah,
but
she was
that's
supposed to
the
be.
thing, right? I mean, this is the whole idea, right? You create a system where everybody is guilty, right? That's the whole idea. Everybody is guilty, but some people get blind eyes and some people do not. And so
Right.
this becomes a perfect way of procuring obedience from content creators because sure enough they've done something wrong. The question now is once that something wrong comes to the surface, are they going to cut slack for you or not? And that's the critical thing.
Although I guess my question tends towards so they're the people at the very top, like your Weinsteins, who got the blind eye turned it towards them for 30 years.
Mhm.
And they're the people who have a great deal of the power in Hollywood. And so the next tier people are the people over whom the feminists turning the blind eye to tier one, they get to exert power over tier two because the people who are getting the blind eye will do some of what the feminists want in exchange for that power, so that when the feminist tries to crucify somebody in tier two, the person who's getting the blind eye in tier one will who has the money and is controlling the money will refuse to work with that person. If you get somebody who doesn't need the blind eye in tier one, when the feminist goes and tells them that, oh no, this person put out the wrong sort of tweet, you have to stop working with them, will that person who doesn't need any of the indulgences have a reason to kowtow? Because it seems to me there's a trickle down of the power. There's that exchange between the feminists in the top tier, and then they get to exert power over the lower tiers. But that's dependent on that relationship, it seems to me.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think they essentially have the cooperation of the top tier is enough, right?
But my point is, if the top tier, but if that is that cooperation, how much of that cooperation at the top tier do you think is based on the top tier being sexual predators and who knows what else, and needing the blind eye turned, and therefore having the feminists have something that they really desperately need, which is essentially that get out of jail free card, almost
Well,
literally.
I think it's a sort of combination. They understand that there's going to be some moral system in Hollywood, and it's more effective to have the feminist one than it is to have the Christian one, because I think the Christian one has proper sexual behavior much more narrowly defined, and they feel that the feminist one serves them better. Even if they're not guilty of crimes like, well, I don't know I guess he is accused of a crime. Even if they're not guilty of malfeasance to the extent that Harvey Weinstein is, they still recognize that the feminist moral system is the only, or the progressive moral system is the most effective one for them, and to a certain degree, they also believe it too. I mean,
Hmm.
this has been this perspective. The progressive perspective grew up out of the mainstream liberal consensus of the 60s and 70s. It didn't. It has since become radicalized, but it has not. It is not actually. It is not actually. It hasn't come out of nowhere, right? So many of these people, especially the boomers, right? They're true believers, right? And they're playing along with it because they just think they're advancing it like any devout religious believer would advance their religion.
That makes sense. It's interesting, an interesting point. Although it brings up an even more interesting point when you talk about the moral system that's favorable, because I'm painting with a very broad brush, and there is some good stuff made in Hollywood to be sure, but an awful lot of what is made in Hollywood is what you might almost call pseudo porn.
Mm.
It's which is a little bit almost odd. It's something actually that perplexed me a bit until someone gave me an explanation. But given the widespread availability of pornography on the internet, why do people bother with all the sex scenes like in things like Game of Thrones or and many R-rated movies and so on? And it was pointed out that there is nonetheless a deep-seated psychological need that a lot of people have to pretend that what they're doing isn't looking at pornography for some reason. And
Mhm.
so that is a big chunk of what goes on in Hollywood and a big chunk of where they make their money. Not exclusively by any means. I mean, they also make a lot of money on explosions and people in costumes punching each other with the force of small bombs and so on. But by which I mean, superhero movies. But at the same time, there's an awful lot of, even in those things, you often get plots that rely on people violating certainly Christian morality in terms of being able to sleep with each other, um, just sort of willy nilly. So that thing that you're talking about the progressive morality being more conducive to what they want to do. Um, I'm curious, how much do you mean that in terms of wanting to make the sort of movies that are not necessarily actually good for people, but simply are you know, things like pornography with plausible deniability?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, I guess you're right that there is a pornographic aspect to Hollywood, and certainly if they were trying to sell this and they made an internal Christian morality, they would have a certain amount of cognitive dissonance that would be much more difficult to overcome. Whereas feminism seems to partially allow for this. I guess this is sort of the what's so useful about feminism is it's sort of fundamentally incoherent, right? Like it's got like these fat contradictions built right into it. So and as they say, from a contradiction you can derive any proposition you want, right? Um, as in mathematics, you can demonstrate that if you assume A and not A, you can prove anything. Um, but
For those who aren't trained in the audience, since you've got both A and not A, various things follow from both of these, which contradict each other. So just pick whichever side you want that has the implications you need at the moment.
yeah, yeah. So the thing is that incoherent moral systems are very, very loose because, okay, is feminism against pornography? Well, in a lot of ways it should be, based on all of the theories that we've seen over the last, based on all the radical theories, certainly it should be. And, I discussed this with ContraPoints in another stream. It was about a year ago, I think. And it's just there's this deep incoherence about how they describe sexual relationships and emotional safety. And they use different words for all of these subjects, but they don't really have any opinion on whether a certain action is right or wrong. They just have certain kinds of optics they like and don't like at any given time that are politically chosen. And that's because I think perhaps certain radical forms of feminism are coherent, but the main ones that you see in that are politically followed by mainstream people are just contradiction piled on contradiction. And so if you're a powerful person who's trying to essentially include pornographic themes while claiming that they're not pornographic themes, it works out really well for you, I guess. I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting to know how much this is conscious, right? I mean, to a certain extent, Hollywood sells sex. To a certain extent, they're also engaged in the same cognitive dissonance as the consumer is, right? As they make it, it's kind of weird, right?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I have some interest in especially screenwriting. I've read a fair number of books on screenwriting, and I get the impression at least screenwriters, at a minimum, are actually pretty cynical people. And so there's a lot of sense within it of how much of what they're doing is sort of pretend. And just to give an example of precedent, to show we're not making this up, and especially that I'm not just making this up, this was exactly the shtick of Playboy magazine. The whole thing where they would get they pay fairly famous writers to put things in, and they'd be philosophical. That they hence there was that whole thing that a person could say, I don't know whether anyone ever took them seriously, but I only read it for the articles.
Yeah.
So I mean, there was that entire shtick of this is not purely pornography; it's an entire thing where it's highbrow philosophy too, that works together with it. So I mean, that pornography with a veneer of not really pornography, or in some sort of context, which is exactly the same thing. A friend of mine keeps telling me about all the the many sex scenes in Game of Thrones, that he assures me that they're all deeply integral to the plot.
Yeah, that's a bit obvious though. In Game of Thrones in particular, that's the sex scenes are very artificially injected into the storyline.
I haven't watched Game of Thrones. I haven't watched TV in so many years myself, but he assures me actually they're not they're critical.
Hmm.
That if you were to actually remove edit the sex scenes out, you wouldn't be able to follow the plot. They're so integral.
I've never heard. Well, okay. I'm the show. My most popular video on my channel is a video where I tear Game of Thrones apart. But I mean, it had its moments, but at no point were its good moments ever related to the sex scenes, nor were the sex scenes ever integral to the plot from whatever I could discern. But I know this is the cognitive dissonance. Maybe the people who, I mean, the amount people can deceive themselves is really quite astonishing, right? Even from a creator's perspective. So perhaps they don't even understand that they're doing this, that they're inserting these highly pornographic scenes into the actual plot. They just think that this is some kind of, you know, uh, ordinary operation of how the plot should unfold.
Yeah, high art. That said, I've heard. I don't know whether or not this is true. I need to track this down. I'd heard that there are actually, HBO has guidelines for its shows that include things like minimum number of nude scenes and so on within an episode. Um, I need to track down whether or not that's actually true.
HBO seems like it does, at least for it. And the number of HBO shows that begin, that where their first episode does not have a nude scene in it is probably pretty small.
mm,
It seems like always the first few episodes in these HBO series have lots of nudity. But I don't know. It definitely is something that is fan service. I don't know.
Which I mean, there's a whole tradition of too of fan service. At least I'm used to that term coming from anime, where it refers to various because they have stricter standards in Japan of what you can show. So various things that are not fully nude cartoons, and these things being inserted in service to the fans who really want to see not fully nude pictures of these fake imaginary people. So just as another example of where for some reason it's not fully pornography in the fan service in anime, at least as I understand it along the mainstream stuff, which is again another example of this sort of pseudo pornography.
Yeah.
So which brings up a very very interesting question, because taking pseudo pornography to be some at least reasonably established as a big thread. What sort of people? Because I'm always interested in selective pressures, because selective pressures always form evolutionary standards and so on, and people don't take evolution nearly seriously enough, is contention of mine. What sort of person wants to go and make pseudo pornography? What sort of person is just fine with doing this and rational?
It's a question that's hard to ask, because my contention in this part is that people don't decide this stuff. There's just a pressure. Okay, but there's money that will appear for people who make this, right? And so the creation of this can move forward without somebody setting forward and going, "I'm going to create pseudo pornography today." It's like, okay, well, we've got a producer that wants this. He needs this to be a big seller. And, he's got some market consultants that say that he has to have, a certain amount of these types of scenes. And I imagine that this sort of gets communicated down the creative process in all sorts of ways, right?
Right, but here's the question. Who do you go to? You have a script where you want 3 nude scenes in it. How do you find a writer to write a good script with 3 nude scenes in it? Because you're not going to,
I always imagine like you had a script, and then the script comes in, and then the producer takes it and he puts it to a focus group, and the focus group sends the rewrites back to the screenwriter, and the screenwriter fights over what stays in and what stays out. I mean, a little bit the same way that you had, like, in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, you had like, a bigger role for that elf princess character, even though it wasn't in the book and Peter Jackson didn't want it. It was because the production focus group felt like it was necessary to the box office to have more female characters. I'm sure that some similar process goes on. to get a
Oh,
certain amount of raciness into the scripts.
oh, sure, but that's once the writer's hired. I'm talking about hiring the writer because I mean I can guarantee you the way they don't do it is walk into their local church and say, "Hey, I need a script with at least three nude scenes. Anyone here want to write it?" You're not going to go to a synagogue.
Well, I think these things are added in later for the most part, if they're not integral to the plot, unless the movie is explicitly erotic, in its original inception, right?
Well, it's taking HBO things, but I guess sort of the point that I'm going for is, again, like people do more than one script, they do more than one show, and so on, and not everybody would write a script in which there are several nude scenes and look at this and think, I'm really proud that I did this. I'm really proud of that show with the three nude scenes in it. This is definitely a good contribution to humanity. And so that's a selective pressure.
Well, they probably don't care one way or the other, right?
Well, I mean, I'm saying if you look at all of humanity, not every single last human being would look at this and be proud of it. Only some would. And so there's a selective pressure on people who would look at this and be proud of it. Because people look at this and think, what the heck did I just do? I'm making the world a worse place.
Well, I guess you could say, like, it definitely selects against people who would actively oppose,
right,
fan service or raciness or even product placement for that matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to get very far as a producer if you're so against capitalism that you think that you can't have you can't include Android phones in one scene, like if you don't have, like, if you see the Fast and the Furious movie, they're always flipping out their little electronic gizmos, right? and that's in addition to the cars that are all product placement, right? I mean, these things are these are really big consumer things that people pay to get into movies, and I'm sure that's a consideration too. So, I mean, the people who make these things are naturally going to be very flexible, right?
Yeah, that's that does seem to me certainly be very much the case. Amusingly, I never notice product placement. I'm always so focused on the plot that people tell me about product placement and go, what product placement? And then they'll point it out. I'm like, well, okay, I get. I mean, you have to have some brand there, but there's a plot going on. It's a blind spot for me. So I just kind of find that amusing. But to stick to the point, and I think you're very right. It's people who are very flexible. But then the question I think comes up: what else? If a person is flexible this way, what else are they likely to be flexible about, or what else? In that sense, and not in a conscious sense, but in a selective sense, like who is going to be highly flexible about all this stuff? And it's again, that's not going to be you're not going to go to look for your local rabbis and priests and pastors and try to look for the most flexible people amongst them. It's just not who person. Not that they're all going to be perfect.
You get people who are naturally flexible in these positions. I mean, in that way, I think, I don't know as it relates to. I mean, I guess people oftentimes wonder how this could occur, with feminism, which is naturally brittle and shrill. And the way it happens is that feminism's brittleness and shrillness is totally selective, and it's not a consistent standard because it couldn't possibly be a consistent standard. And its utility insofar as it relates to the film industry and other industries where people have to have flexibility is that it's essentially a rent-seeking operation. The feminists will agree to look away given that people are on their side politically, given that they have these diversity considerations taken on board. And that's because, it couldn't exist as a consistent standard because it's fundamentally incoherent. You could fundamentally find any action sexist, racist, homophobic in the progressive idea, in the progressive conception of the universe. And
I've seen hilarious examples of that. If you do something, you've got a sexist explanation for it. If you don't do something, there's a sexist explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be done for a lot of things. So yeah, that's very true. That there's an element of do you want to find the sexist? Because if you do, you can.
And so the triumph of progressivism in Hollywood seems to me to be the triumph of rent-seeking over moral standards, essentially. That Hollywood would rather have an indulgence system that they can pay up than some kind of thing that would say, okay, look, guys, you're actually going to feel guilty for making a movie that, egregiously pushes a pornographic view of sex, or that has, egregious project placement, or any number of creative compromises. The whole movie is a compromise in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there are lots of
Or a
sex is
moral
easy to
compromise in a
talk
lot
about.
of ways.
Yeah, sex is easy to talk about, but there are things, things like disloyalty, for example. I mean, there are tons and tons of movies in which um, disloyalty is more or less glossed over in a main character.
Although I feel like there were more in the 60s, actually.
Hmm. Yeah, well, that may well be. I haven't seen a movie in the theaters in over 10 years, so I'm kind of
Okay.
thinking more generally. I don't mean my commentary to be about movies in the last 2 years, um, but sort of looking at things over the decades, starting from when the decency league's influence disappeared to the present.
I'm just
Um,
thinking of like Dr. Zhivago or something like that, maybe. But I'm digressing here, right?
Well, and so what's interesting actually in your description of the rent seeking is that the nice thing about a extremely contradictory rent seeking thing is that it gives you a lot of flexibility.
It does.
To return to the
And
previous
Hollywood
subject,
pay for flexibility because its margins are so large.
yeah,
Its margins aren't large in this country, but given that Hollywood has had enormous success in the last 15 years internationalizing itself to the point where most blockbusters make, I think at this point, most of their money in China
mm,
and
um,
and that will only grow, right?
yeah.
So
There's an asterisk on China because China has talking to someone who knows about this a few months ago. The thing is, China has like a strict cap on how many American movies, it's willing to let in each year. So only a few, and it's something small. It's like 20 movies or something like that. 10 movies, 20 movies, something in that range, I believe. I wish I had the details at hand. But it's something small so that most movies can't rely on China specifically. But yes, overseas stuff um, is the bulk of most large movies take. That is absolutely true.
yeah, and so that large margin gets them to a point where they need to operate these movies as something that's entirely flexible and can be rewritten in order to get the maximum amount of people into the theaters, and that's the game they're playing, right?
Mm. Yeah. Now, there's also sort of the topic of people who have very flexible morality. I mean, we're talking about a slightly different flexibility, so I'm sort of segueing a little bit in flexible morality. But if I recall correctly, one of the people who you had up in your video was actually Louis C.K.
Mm-hmm.
And he also interests me in that much of his shtick was being a deeply immoral person. I never saw much of his stuff, but somebody somebody on Twitter I saw had talked about
Mm-hmm.
um, something he did where he was talking with some woman and then was telling her that he was going to go home and masturbate, think about her while masturbating. There's nothing she could do to stop him, which um, brings up another interesting subject. But and specifically that a lot of the
it,
immorality. Oh,
it's
sorry.
amazing how that's, well, I mean, it's not amazing, but it's amazing how, well, obviously, that is offensive to me because I'm a Christian, and most people who are classical oriented, it's offensive to. But it's amazing how much feminists and progressives are still offended by that statement, right? It's still an asshole thing to say to somebody, even who doesn't believe in some kind of theology of the body, sacredness of sex, even though there's no real reason for it to be offensive in that way
Yeah,
under that moral system.
no, that's true. Although there's
That's
also
carried
another
over.
fascinating thing about it that a lot of people, though officially offended by it, won't be, especially if they're fans of Louis C.K., would not be offended by it because there's this tremendous flexibility, just to return to this theme, of, well, he wasn't serious. And then they're shocked when
Mm.
it turns out that he was serious.
Yeah, yeah.
And that sort of playing with it, that flexibility, is something that I think you see all throughout. That a lot of, I mean, it comes under the heading of titillation, of pretending to be bad, um, while saying like, it's just pretend, it's just play. We're not really being bad. What are you objecting to? Why are you so uptight?
Mm-hmm.
And
You imagine you also mentioned the guy who did Cards Against Humanity, right?
oh
Before he was
yeah,
thrown in the
yeah,
street, right?
yeah. I'd heard again. Who knows whether or not the accusation. I heard that the accusation exists. Who knows whether or not it's true. So to um, bear that in mind. This is very much in the alleged. I heard that this has been alleged category, but yeah, it Cards Against Humanity. Okay, so like the guy who made it did bad things. I'm shocked. The guy who came up with a game in which you pretend to be bad actually
Mm-hmm.
was bad.
Well, it kind of goes to that C.S. Lewis quote from the Screw Tape Letters that at the end of the day, humans eventually become what they pretend to be.
Mm, I love the Screw Tape Letters.
And, and sort of like simulating bad behaviors for yourself eventually means that you will start imitating those bad behaviors.
Yeah, and it's also especially it's funny. The uh, In order to if you were raised in such a way that you wouldn't do something, in order to overcome that, if it's not through straight up trauma, um, usually the way one overcomes it is by getting used to the idea of doing the thing that one thinks of as bad. So there's straight up trauma. Somebody who normally wouldn't hurt somebody, and then something is tremendously angered, like somebody does something to their child or something like that, and then they just fly off the handle and go and murder somebody. So there is that approach, but if not, like it's really fascinating the way if you look at you know scandals, financial scandals like Enron and other things like that, people embezzling, is that it always starts with people doing defensible actions that are they're kind of on the line, but they're defensible, and then
Mm-hmm.
but they do it, they get away with it, nothing really bad happened, and then they're starting to get used to the idea that being next to the line is fine, and then when they really get onto the line, well, just being just a little bit over, how bad is that? And it's a process of acclimation, and now much is made about things like the violent video games would turn everybody into homicidal maniacs, which is obviously didn't happen, and sort of um, obviously not true in that respect. But there are a lot of things where um, pretend villainy can have that effect of letting you get used to something that you might actually plausibly do.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. I mean, we're all aware that exposure to things like pornography and violence and this has an effect on us to a certain degree. It desensitizes us to these things. Um, in some sense, I think the exposure to violence is simulated violence is paradoxically less harmful than the exposure to um, simulated sex, because I think that modern man is in a position where being massively desensitized to violence doesn't really have impact on his life, whereas being massively desensitized to sex puts people's own sexual behaviors in a position where they want their sex drives to have sort of an ordinary operating mode, and then it's not available for them, right? Um, you know,
Yeah,
and and so perhaps you know, so there's that, right? But we all know these things have an effect. Hollywood needs, in order for it to operate, it needs us to believe that these things do not have an effect. And this is sort of the whole contradiction. This is the whole Anita Sarkeesian thing, right? I think this is sort of what Gamergate was a little bit getting at. Gamergate, I find sort of infinitely fascinating. When I say Gamergate, I mean the entire brouhaha that started with Anita Sarkeesian and ended with the literal, gamers revolt with the hashtag in 2015, right? Um, I found this endlessly fascinating because of the fact that what was it, 2014? I forget. I find it fascinating because it it sort of Anita Sarkeesian could not exist and do the things she did in Hollywood, right? Or if she did, there would have been too many people who would have stopped her, right? I had a talk with a progressive who is an Anita Sarkeesian a fan. I think he even appeared on her podcast once or twice, and he's like, "Oh yeah, Anita, she's just pointing out the obvious, these sexist interpretations of women in video games. It totally affect us." And I'm like, well, yeah, and he admitted that. I mean, he was an avid consumer of pornography, and I'm like, well, what about all the sexist depictions of women in pornography? And he's like, well, yeah, but that's just porn. I'm like, I don't know. There are sexist depictions of women in video games, to be sure, and probably it affects us at some very, very, very minor level. But that just pales in comparison to the amount of sexism that exists in porn, that exists in movies. And to a certain degree, the Gamergate was right when they say that the gamers are they're being essentially selected, right? As the feminists wanted something, right? They wanted to get this implicit bias type analysis of media into a major media industry. It wasn't going to roll in Hollywood. It was certainly not going to roll in any pornography industry. So video games was it, because it was a pastime that had very, very low clout. But we all know that something like this is true. We all know that to some degree our media consumption habits affect us when it comes to our moral decision making.
Something that should be pointed out too is that we're talking. I mean, all of these things have narrative elements to them. And the narrative structure is highly important to the effect that a thing is going to have. And one of the things about a lot of the violence that you have in movies and in video games is that it is very often, and especially stuff made 10, 20, 30 years ago, but I think still a lot of stuff today, a lot of it is morally justified violence. That is to say, it is defense of self or others. And, it take things, stuff that it takes part in the context of what is presumed to be a just war, in the case of war-based games. Mm-hmm. In the case of the classic story of the hero with the evil empire and so on, who's always being attacked and always defending himself, that it's always portrayed in a context in which it is morally correct, and that is part of the narrative. And one of the things that Anita love to do in the small amount of stuff I saw of hers and other things I heard, was that she loved to rip it out of context. Say, well, this is violence, regardless of whether the narrative structure provided this as as morally justified or not. Whereas much of the sexual content that you have is not, especially by a Christian moral standard, morally justified. It's actually rather immoral in quite a large number of cases. It's very, very often fornicative, sometimes adulterous.
I'd say most of it is premarital, but I mean, I don't know. I guess this is the question, right? Like, could you slap a marriage narrative on pornography and remove the damage of pornography? Probably not in a lot of regards, right? I mean, I know this is an interesting topic. I don't know if there's something there. I mean, you're right that there's sort of this narrative immorality, and there's sort of a just like an image immorality, right? I could show intricate pictures of German children getting blown apart by Allied bombs, and the bombing campaign might be justified in like a just war theory, but the repetition of children being butchered, would convey sort of a pornographic immorality in itself. And I guess so. There's like two levels going on there, right?
Yeah, well, and that's actually, one thing that I object to, it seems to be there are increasingly more video games in which there isn't, the violence is not. The violence you partake in is not morally justified. Like God of War, actually, it's somewhat old now, but it's weird because you're playing the bad guy. I mean, Kratos is the villain of the story. It's really, really strange that you're outright playing the villain, defeating the heroes. Until eventually you manage to have your nihilistic victory and destroy all life. I mean, it's a weird arc, and kind of disturbing for that reason, that it's unlike most things you're indulging in this, which is generally bad. But an interesting thing related to that in the violence is that, by and large, the unjustified violence would not typically be shown. I mean, look at Star Wars, where Anakin Skywalker slaughters the children. He ignites his lightsaber, and then they cut to a different scene. They don't show you
Yeah.
that part. And
This is the whole thing. I think video games are a different genre in this regard, in that they do have an audience that revels in evil. That's why Grand Theft Auto sold so well. And one of my favorite games, or the sequel to one of my favorite games, well, I mentioned this last stream we did. One of my favorite games, BioShock, has a very violent plot. And the original one, it had a narrative where that violence seemed sort of more morally justified. But the sequel, it was trying to tell sort of like this moral story, but it didn't really have a very good justification for the violence. So a lot of secular fans, because it was so narrative and so cinematic, got disgusted by the existence of the violence itself, because the plot was fundamentally at odds with the amount of violence you were committing against these virtual video game characters. And so that was sort of a major design flaw of that game. And so I think video games are different in that regard, right? I think that video games, for some reason, there tends to be more market to. I mean, it's sort of a pornographic dimension too, right? Like, video games they're sort of selling the sensation of power, and if you're doing evil, that sensation of power is sort of heightened, just like, in pornography, breaking a taboo is sexy, regardless of what the taboo is, which is why people, if you use pornography, you'll find that your viewing habits they degrade again and again and again and again, because, the violation of taboo is half of the titillation you're getting from it.
Mm. Yeah. Now, another thing that relates to, because the immoral violence in video games is something I actually find deeply concerning myself. Because indulging in evil, like the other thing, which also comes up in C.S. Lewis's the Screwtape Letters, is that there's another problem too, which is that indulging in evil may not predispose you to that particular evil, but it may well lessen your resistance to some other evil. And or in the modern context, for the sake of viewers, by using evil, I mean immorality. Sometimes evil gets used to mean only the most extreme immorality possible. I was using it in a more philosophical sense of anything that is the opposite of good. But the thing about sex, I mean, there are two things about sex. One, it's the sexual instinct has an astonishing power in a way that very few other instincts do. I mean, food does, breathing, but they're really easy to satisfy. Of the instincts that are not really easy to satisfy for most Westerners, sex is much more powerful than instincts towards violence. But there's another thing too, which is that if a person is defending, an innocent, if a person is being attacked and somebody is defending that innocent person, it is entirely legitimate to look on and watch this. Like if you see one person defending another, like on the street, it's not, the correct thing to do is not to, shield your eyes or turn away. If a husband and wife are having sex, you should not be in their bedroom watching. So even, even the most virtuous, even completely virtuous sex, sex between a husband and wife, is not something that a third party should be seeing anyway. So there's that asymmetry as well, I think. So it makes, so sex becomes it's an unusual thing. It's somewhat in a category of its own, and you can also see this in within the culture war. There isn't much of a culture war over boxing or mixed martial arts. They exist. A lot of people aren't into them. Some people disapprove, but we don't have a major cultural upheaval over the desire to ban boxing or the desire to make bare knuckle boxing legal. I have no idea.
Traditionally, taboos on sex were much more stringent than taboos on violence. And I think there's a number of highly justified reasons for that, right? Once you get past the sort of like 13-year-old, adults don't care about violence, they don't care about violence being depicted, but don't show any sex, right? I mean, that's sort of like the whole smart-ass teenage college student argument against this, but there are good reasons for making sex more taboo than violence in society. And almost all societies that have had artistic depictions have had high taboos against depictions of sex, and much looser ones towards the depiction of violence.
Yeah, I mean, and just I mean, simple observation shows you that you don't need to worry about epidemics of a third of your population going out and murdering another third of your population for funsies. It just doesn't happen. And no matter how many depictions of violence you have, you don't need to worry about, a quarter, a third, a tenth, a 20th of your population being murdered each year, just, because people have been watching violence. But fornication, there is quite a lot of in society, and you could have.
It's not just fornication. It's what we're saying right now. It's the crumbling of all sex in general.
Well, yeah.
I don't like the word gender, but let's just use gender roles because that's what everyone uses. It's the crumbling of gender roles and sexual complementarity in culture writ large, and that's horribly disastrous to a society. I mean, Camilla Paglia. Oh God, I'm not doing very well with pronunciation. She was right. Societies that cannot enforce gender complementarity or sexual complementarity are doomed.
Mm.
And we could be heading into a massive civilizational decline.
Well, we kind of seem to already be in a maybe you mean something different by civilizational decline.
Well, a steeper one than we are in currently.
It seems very plausible, especially because one of the big effects of it. One of the big reasons I talk about fornication, though adultery, of course, is also a massive problem. But in both cases, it in theory, people think, well, what's the problem? Because of course, sex is no more significant than shaking a person's hand. And obviously there are emotional components, but the other thing is that it often doesn't work. Contraception often doesn't work, and you get on the one hand, and on the other too, you get people who can't build stable long-term relationships that can endure through significant stress, which is guaranteed to come if you actually have children. See, because children are massive stressors, as becomes your partner once they're stressed as well. So when you have people who are used to romantic relationships being all fluffy and positive and not, all that long term, that you get tremendous amounts of single parenthood, which is, except for a few ideologues, everyone acknowledges to be massively bad for the children involved. So just to sort of put this in, this is not just us clucking our tongues that people are behaving in ways we disapprove of, but the point being, these things are just disapproved of precisely because they have such massive observable negative externalities, like children not being raised well, children being, raised in very broken homes.
This is sort of the key thing about. This is actually funny, but people like ContraPoints and Christy Winters, they'll try to actually argue that there aren't these huge disadvantages from single parent homes, but the evidence is so manifest that there really is. I'm actually surprised they haven't gotten called out more by their own side from this issue. I think basically it is just that. People don't have a coherent system to fall back on. If you're somebody in sort of the liberal, moderate Democrat camp, right? What are you going to do, right? Your options are basically to go back to Christian morality, or to hope that you can sort of stop the feminist ball from rolling to its logical conclusion in radical intersectional feminism. No, maybe there is a coherent version of intersectional feminism, but it doesn't look anything like how feminism is actually practiced politically in the mainstream these days. But that's the contradiction at the heart of Hollywood. That's the contradiction at the heart of Harvey Weinstein. That's the contradiction at the heart of this whole relationship that progressive politics has to these abusive men. And that is the sort of liberal, just let me do what I want, type of moderate Democrat. He doesn't want to go to Christian morality because it doesn't make exceptions. He can't buy it off. So he goes to progressivism because you can, for the moment, you can buy it off. And so the cognitive dissonance is that at that point, feminism writ large has to explain away the disadvantage of single parent families.
Mm.
And so it can't. But then again, it never really gets called on it by people like Jon Stewart and these, Stephen Colbert, right? Because
Mm.
they find some way to kind of like make the problem not part of the discussion. And that's because the alternative is to essentially shoot down the entire feminist project.
Yeah, yeah. No, I do think that you could form a coherent feminist morality on. It would be hard, but I think you could do it on the basis of essentially contract law. Because they go into a great degree for personal autonomy and personal autonomy. Uh, like
Yeah, you could do like you could do an anarcho-libertarian version of it, right?
yeah, on the social front, yeah. So that since we've eliminated marriage as such, you could, however, come up with a life partner contract, which was actually binding and which had special status where you could get specific enforcement, and and then the two parties could consider this and then write down all the mutual obligations such as sexual exclusivity, being together around the children all the time with minor exceptions for traveling, and they could basically spend a very long time recreating marriage on an ad hoc basis and as a contractual thing, and then have you could even have a party after the two of you sign this contract. So I mean, they could effectively recreate it through a sort of explicit contract model, since they, you know, that would that would allay the problem of society had imposed this. So like if you go and impose it yourself, then it would sort of pass muster, at least officially speaking. But it wouldn't have any of the qualities you were just talking about being able to be bought
so
off.
feminists won't accept that, right? Feminists won't accept that because people like Rushdi and the pickup artists will be the people benefiting, and not anybody that are their constituents. So, I mean, this is the problem. This is the deep incoherence of feminism, right? Like I said, maybe very, very, very far to an intersection down the intersectional line, you might find some kind of culturally stable matriarchal idea that feminists have. But right now, someone like ContraPoints, when I pressed him on it, he could not actually come up with a good reason why Rushdi was wrong. He made an hour video complaining about him, right? I mean, the best he could do was like, oh, it's because Rushdi practices implicit deception in his seduction techniques. But then when I pressed him on how most one night stands are facilitated in gay communities or progressive straight communities, he openly admitted that facilitating implicit deception was how those consensual interactions went on too. So this is the thing. He doesn't have an answer for this. He doesn't. And so the whole idea of contractual consent being that feminism can achieve coherent sexual ethics by going to contractual consent, it's not strictly speaking true. They don't have an answer there. They have a hope, right?
Yeah, I meant that it is something that could be moved to. It simply would have none of the it would effectively have none of the qualities that they actually want out of the project.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, it's basically like how it was very easy to keep people unified on the equality front once you thought that, getting rid of these explicit barriers in racial discrimination would be sufficient to cause economic equality between the races, in a 50-year time frame. But now that we see 50 years down the road that the removal of these explicit de jure barriers has not resulted in economic equality, the consensus kind of goes away from there.
Yeah, it's Chesterton had a great I call it parable if you want, of people who there's a lamppost and there's a cry that goes up to tear it down, and there's a monk who says, well, first, brethren, let's consider the use of light. And then the crowd just knocks him down and goes and tears it down. But having torn the lamppost down, they then can't agree because people had very different reasons for tearing it down. Some because they wanted to put up a different lamppost, some because they just didn't like lampposts and wanted a different sort of light-bearing implement. Some because they simply wanted to, liked the darkness because their deeds were evil. And so it's much easier to get consensus to destroy things than it is to get consensus to build things.
And I'm sure it was that lamppost that majestically found its way into the Chronicles of Narnia. The idea of the lamppost standing on itself in the forest. But that's the problem. The problem is, and this is, I had an atheist challenge which nobody responded to. I mean, there are lots of atheists that responded. I said I wanted to have a discussion about positive ethical and metaphysical systems that could replace Christianity. Like anything, like whatever one you have, let's come on my show and let's discuss it, right? Like anything you can think of, communism, anarchism. I mean, those are political systems, but still, I mean, communism has an applied metaphysics as well. It just it denies it, but like whatever you have, let's come on my show and let's discuss it. No takers, none. Like you got a lot of people commenting, wanting to do endless, like, aggressive Twitter back and forth, which I don't do. Logic is he's still butthurt that I won't have a Twitter. He wants response videos, and I'm like, no, I just come on let's do a live stream. Like, I'm not doing endless response videos so they can be misinterpreted. But probably will respond to this. But the thing is it's so eminently obvious that so much of the secular worldview is running away from answering these questions. And that's because that they're only ever powerful because there is the implication that they had a better solution, not because they actually had one, right? And that they could be idealists and tear down the previous system, and then now we're standing here and going, okay, like Chesterton's lamppost, what's going to go in its place? Well, probably nothing. But I think, practically speaking, from a cultural war point of view, I mean, this is an enormous opportunity. I think that feminism is going to be coming into these spaces in its full radical form. And it's going to try to impose itself like an ethical system. It's going to demand more purity tests. And that could be hugely problematic for Hollywood. They could purity spiral right out of their international market.
They could. They really could, and especially with other, other markets. People in other places are gearing up to, learning how to do the trades as well. Because a lot of what Hollywood trades on is, in fact, skilled tradesmen. In makeup and set design, and lighting and filming and so on. So there's those skills are movable, and people can move for jobs if other people can actually fund the movies. But there's a really interesting thing that's related to that, I think, a point on that, and probably an interesting decent one to end on, is that the people who step up to fill voids but whenever you destroy a system, the people who step up to replace it are never the moderates. You can see this. The French Revolution is, I think, a perfectly good example. You can use tons of other revolutions too. But who stepped up in the French Revolution to actually be in charge? The people who put in place the Reign of Terror. And that's something I think very much to look for is, if you have the power vacuum created by successfully destroying something, who's going to step in to be the leader? Because someone has to. And it's going to be the most convinced people, the people who desperately want power, the people for whom their vision is the clearest.
And then after them, perhaps a Thermidorian reaction.
Exactly. So it dovetails nicely with what you're talking about in terms of the opportunity in the culture war, that and also that idea that things often get worse before they get better. And getting worse before you get better can be winding up the pendulum to swing back the other way. So
yeah, I don't always like the pendulum analogy, but in a reactionary sense, if you imagine this being a huge oscillation,
well, it's a more like a Foucault pendulum. Foucault,
yeah,
Foucault pendulum. It takes a really, really, really long time before you ever actually get back to where you were. It keeps on swinging back and forth, but because of the rotation of the Earth, it changes, and you wind up in different places. Interesting as a metaphor, anyway. It's it's not a simple pendulum between 2 points, but a much more complex space. Anyway, but so notes of hope for the future. Good. One thing, one of the benefits in terms of looking to the future, both you and I have as Catholics, is that we know that the world has fallen and we're never going to get perfection, no matter what.
Yeah. Well, I'd settle for I am sort of devoutly hoping that Hollywood takes this fall as hard as possible because I'm just tired of Hollywood. I think it produces poor content. It produces redundant content. It's kept in place largely due to the fact that it has a lot of money and a lot of people who legally defend it. But I can't think of what Hollywood is really giving to me. That I can think of a lot of ways that Hollywood is making my goals a lot harder and a lot. I can't think of anything it's really given to me that's been particularly edifying. It seems like a lot of empty entertainment recently, especially.
Well, I mean, there'll be another reboot of Spider-Man coming along soon.
Yeah, endless Marvel movies. Oh, good lord. Yeah, I mean, again, it's also I know I'm always really behind on videos because of work and and engagement and school and so I have a sort of a video about atheism and truth coming out uh, as soon as I finish putting it all together and editing. But after that, the big project was going to be doing one on entertainment and nerd culture and geek culture, and really sort of because I think that's sort of insofar as there's going to be a generational change between Gen Xers and Boomers and Millennials. I think sort of the nerd culture, the enthusiast culture that gave birth to the Marvel movies will start becoming additionally culturally ascendant, or it will become more culturally ascendant. And I want to I want to understand sort of more about how that's going to work. So I don't know, perhaps there'll be
Interesting
something
topic.
there. Yeah.
I look forward to that. So, well, thank you very much. It's been a very
Oh
interesting
yeah, no
conversation.
problem. All right, thanks. I'll hope to do live stream in the future.
Yep. God bless.
Well, I hope you enjoyed watching that conversation as much as I had being in it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.